The tropical heat hit Jackson Hayes like a punch the moment he stepped off the transport aircraft. It was February, but in Sangley Point, Cavite, the air felt like a burning blanket wrapped around his entire body. Sweat formed instantly on his forehead, slipping down the bridge of his nose. Jackson had gone through the freezing waves of Coronado, had survived Hell Week, had endured training that broke hundreds of men. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. He pulled off his sunglasses and looked around the base. The ground was a mix of sand, gravel, and sea salt dust. Palm trees swayed lazily in the wind, but nothing here looked lazy. Not the operators running drills in formation, not the instructors observing with hawk-like stares, not even the sea, which swirled aggressively against the shoreline as if preparing its own tests. Jackson smirked. "Let's see what you've got," he whispered to himself. But the moment his eyes locked on the Filipino operators warming up, his confidence dipped. They weren't big. They weren't bulky. They didn't look like the towering Special Forces soldiers he was used to. Instead, they were lean, nimble, almost relaxed, but their movements were precise, economical, deadly. And at the front of them stood a man who instantly caught Jackson's attention. Matthew, shorter than Jackson. Slimmer, quiet, unassuming. But there was something in his eyes, depth, storms, experience carved deep into silence. Jackson had seen men with 1,000-yard stares. Matthew had a 1,000-mile stare, like he had walked through jungles, mountains, oceans, and battles that pushed him to the edge of death and back. Jackson extended his hand with a friendly American grin. "Seal Hayes, good to meet you, brother." Matthew nodded once. No handshake, no smile. "Let's begin." And that was it. No welcome, no tour, no introduction, just the beginning. Before Jackson could breathe properly, the instructors shouted, "Logs! Mud run, move!" They ran to a field of knee-deep mud, thick, heavy, dense, the kind of mud that grabs your boots and refuses to let go. Jackson lifted the log onto his shoulder, too quickly, too confidently. His foot sank almost instantly. The mud nearly swallowed him whole. Every step felt like dragging cement. The Filipino operators moved like they practiced this their whole lives. Their rhythm was synchronized, their focus unbroken. Their breathing steady, Jackson slipped. The log crashed into the mud. He fell face first, tasting dirt and salt. He cursed under his breath and tried to push himself up. But then an arm grabbed him. "Matthew, keep moving, brother," Matthew said quietly. "NAVSOG doesn't leave anyone behind." Jackson froze for a moment. No mocking, no superiority, just brotherhood. He nodded, swallowed his pride, and lifted the log again. Next came the obstacle course. A brutal series of rope climbs, wall jumps, underwater tunnels, and long-distance sprints. The sun was merciless, the humidity was suffocating. The instructors were relentless. Jackson grabbed the climbing rope, but sweat made his hands slide. His arms were trembling from the swim. Halfway up, he felt himself slipping. Matthew climbed past him, smooth and fast, reaching the top while Jackson still fought for balance. Jackson wanted to swear, wanted to yell, wanted to prove himself, but all he could do was keep climbing. Then came the underwater tunnel, a narrow, pitch-black tube beneath the pier. Jackson took a deep breath and dove in. The darkness swallowed him. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. His chest tightened, panic crawled into his mind. His lungs begged for air. His arms flailed until he finally felt the exit and burst out into daylight. He gasped violently, coughing water. Matthew was already waiting outside the tunnel, offering a hand to pull him up. Jackson took it without hesitation. The next days took them deep into the Philippine jungle. The air felt thick enough to chew. Mosquitoes swarmed like tiny predators. Every inch of the wilderness pulsed with life and danger. Jackson had trained in deserts. He had survived mountains. He had trekked through forests. But the jungle was different. The jungle watched him. Matthew moved silently, teaching him step by step how to walk without noise, how to read bird patterns, how to use the wind to hide movement, how to spot danger before danger spots you. Jackson listened harder than he had in years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the teacher. He was the student, and the jungle was the classroom. They were dropped into the jungle with nothing but knives. "Return to base by morning," the instructor said. "No food, no assistance. Jackson thought he had this under control, but the jungle drained him faster than he expected. Sweat poured down his face. His stomach growled painfully. His legs felt like they were carrying sandbags. Matthew, on the other hand, found edible plants, caught fish using only stones, built a fire in minutes, moved with the ease of someone raised by the wilderness itself. As they shared the small fish, Jackson felt humbled. He had survived so many missions, but this man, this operator from a distant archipelago, had mastered an environment Jackson barely understood. Night came, and with it, fear. The jungle became pitch black. Every sound felt like a whisper of death. Insects buzzed loud in the darkness. Branches snapped in the distance. Wind shifted unpredictably. Jackson's heartbeat was loud in his ears. Matthew noticed and whispered, "Stay close." They moved through darkness like ghosts. Matthew guided him using stars and instincts honed far beyond textbooks or manuals. Jackson followed, not because he was weak, but because Matthew had earned his respect. They reached camp before dawn. Jackson collapsed, exhausted, muddy, scratched, but proud. He had survived. The final test of the phase was hand-to-hand combat. Jackson entered the ring confident. He was bigger, stronger, heavier. He thought he would win easily. But Matthew didn't fight with power. He fought with timing, with precision, with flow. Every punch Jackson threw missed. Every grab he attempted was countered. Every movement Matthew made was efficient and controlled. And in seconds, Jackson was on the ground. Matthew tapped his shoulder. "You're strong," he said softly. "But strength alone is never enough." Jackson laughed, breathing hard. "You're on another level, brother." Matthew only shook his head. "We are all still learning." On the final day, the commander called Jackson forward. All the Filipino operators stood around him. Jackson expected a handshake, maybe a thank you. Instead, the commander handed him a NAVSOG patch. "You finished every challenge," he said. "You never gave up. Keep this patch to remind you that true strength comes from humility and heart." Jackson felt emotion hit his chest like a wave. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He clutched the patch as if it were made of gold. Matthew walked up beside him. "You earned it," he said quietly. Jackson nodded, overwhelmed. "I came here to test myself, but I learned more than I ever expected." Matthew smiled. "The ocean and the jungle show you who you really are." As Jackson boarded the helicopter to leave, he stared down at the training grounds, the logs, the tunnels, the jungle tree line, and the Filipino operators standing strong, unmoving, united. He lifted his hand in farewell. Matthew lifted his in return. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt humbled, stronger, better, different. He wasn't leaving with pride. He was leaving with respect. The helicopter blades roared overhead as Jackson Hayes stared down at Sangley Point, shrinking beneath him. The base grew smaller. The operators became tiny dots, and the ocean expanded into an endless sheet of blue. Yet the patch he held in his hand felt heavier than any medal he had ever received. He wasn't leaving the Philippines the same man who arrived. The sun beat through the chopper's window, but Jackson didn't notice. He was lost in thought, replaying the swim, the mud, the jungle, the tunnel, the fight. Every memory came like flashes of lightning. He had survived elite training before, but this was different. Jackson squeezed the NAVSOG patch between his fingers, tracing the edges. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't polished, but it meant something far deeper. It meant he had been tested by a force he never expected. Not the environment, not the physical torture, not the endless training, but by the quiet humility of men who didn't brag, didn't boast, and didn't seek recognition. They simply did what needed to be done. The helicopter shook slightly as it descended toward the U.S. camp. When the doors opened, a wave of dry California air replaced the heavy humidity of the Philippines. Several Navy SEALs ran up to greet him.
"Jack, finally!"
"How was it? You crushed the training or what?" Jackson forced a laugh. "If only they knew. Those NAVSOG boys," he said, shaking his head. "They're different, built from something special." The SEALs laughed, thinking he was joking. "What, they beat you?" One teased, but Jackson didn't smile arrogantly like he used to. He spoke softly, sincerely. "No, they taught me." The group fell silent. That was the first sign that Jackson had changed. A few days later, Jackson walked into his commanding officer's office, a quiet room filled with old mission photos and framed awards. His officer, Commander Reeves, looked up from his desk. "Sit, Hayes. I want your report on the joint training with the Filipino unit." Jackson sat down, his posture unusually calm. Reeves expected a typical operational briefing, technical notes, logistics, maybe some critiques. But Jackson didn't start with tactics. He didn't start with evaluations. He didn't start with weaknesses or strengths. He started with people. "Sir," Jackson began, "NAVSOG trains differently from any elite unit I've seen. Their strength isn't loud, it isn't aggressive. It's pure controlled, rooted in teamwork." Reeves raised an eyebrow. That wasn't the Jackson he knew. "How so?" he asked. Jackson leaned forward. "They don't push each other with insults or ego. They don't compete internally. Everything they do, from swimming to mud runs to survival drills, is done as a single unit. And when someone falls behind, they lift him up." Literally, Reeves nodded slowly, intrigued. Jackson continued, "They don't waste energy on bragging. They put everything into the mission, into discipline, into heart." Reeves studied him. "Sounds like you learned something important," he said. Jackson took in a breath. "Yes, sir. I learned that toughness isn't surviving pain. It's staying calm when everything goes wrong. It's helping the man beside you. And it's fighting with purpose, not pride." For a long moment, Reeves didn't say a word. Then he nodded deeply, a rare sign of approval. "Good work, Hayes. You're bringing something back that's worth more than data." Jackson stood. "Permission to incorporate NAVSOG lessons into training routines here?" Reeves smiled faintly. "Permission granted." And just like that, Jackson's transformation continued. Months later, Jackson stood before new SEAL recruits. Once he would have yelled and pushed them with hardness, but now he taught differently. He taught them silent movement, breath control, and calm in the face of fear. "Where did you learn this, sir?" a recruit asked. "From some incredible warriors in the Philippines," he replied, shaping a new generation of soldiers. One afternoon, Jackson opened his locker. The NAVSOG patch was pinned inside. He touched it lightly. Whenever he felt pride, he looked at the patch. He remembered the jungle, the fight he lost, and the hand Matthew extended to help him up. It grounded him, reminding him that the only way to grow is to never stop learning. Years passed. Then came an announcement, a joint training exercise in the Philippines. Jackson volunteered instantly. Stepping off the aircraft, he felt the humid jungle air and smiled. He was home. Matthew saw him. Their handshake was firm, brotherly. Matthew's eyes fell to Jackson's uniform. Right under the SEAL emblem was the NAVSOG patch. "You kept it," Matthew said. Jackson nodded. "I earned it, and I'll never forget what it stands for." This time, Jackson moved with precision and respect. "You've grown," Matthew said as they trekked through the jungle. This wasn't a test anymore, it was a reunion. On the final day of his return trip, Jackson stood at the shore of Sangley Point. The waves rolled gently this time, the sun setting in orange and gold behind the horizon. He looked at the water, the same water that nearly broke him years before. He looked at the jungle, the same jungle that taught him how to listen, breathe, and survive. He realized something profound. This place didn't just challenge him, it revealed him. It stripped away the arrogance he once wore like armor. It rebuilt him from the inside. True strength, he finally understood, isn't in muscles, height, or pride. It's in humility, discipline, teamwork, respect, and the willingness to learn from anyone, anywhere. Matthew walked up beside him. "Brother," he said softly, "remember, you carry two families now, Navy SEALs and NAVSOG." Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know," he said, "and I won't forget." They stood in silence, side by side, watching the waves. Jackson didn't feel like a foreigner in this land anymore. He felt connected, rooted, changed forever. The waves rolled softly onto the shore as Jackson and Matthew stood there in silence, watching the sunset melt across the horizon. The orange light reflected off the water like a trail of fire stretching toward the fading sun. In that moment, Jackson felt something he hadn't felt during all his years of training, missions, and deployments. Peace. Not the fragile kind that disappears with the next assignment, but the deep, grounded peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and who helped shape you into that person. But peace never lasts long for a soldier. The next morning, before the joint training officially concluded, an unexpected message arrived at the NAVSOG command post. A distress call. A small Filipino fishing boat had sent out a broken signal. Storm winds were rolling in fast. The seas were turning violent. Most operators were scattered across the facility, prepping for drills or organizing gear. Only a few were immediately available: Jackson, Matthew, and 2 Filipino operators. No hesitation, no second guessing. Within minutes, they boarded a high-speed boat and blasted into the open water. The winds howled, the sky turned from blue to gray. Crashing waves slammed against the hull, each one threatening to flip the small craft. Jackson gripped the rail tightly. This was no drill. The waves grew larger with every passing second. Sheets of rain hammered their faces. Salt water stung Jackson's eyes. But Matthew stood at the bow, stable even as the boat lurched violently. "We're close," Matthew shouted over the roaring wind. Lightning flashed. For a split second, Jackson saw it, a small fishing vessel barely afloat, tilting dangerously against the waves. "There!" Jackson yelled. The engine roared as they approached. The fishermen were clinging to the wooden edges of the sinking boat. One wrong wave would send them underwater. The mission was simple: rescue them. But nothing about it was easy. Matthew and Jackson leapt into action. The storm wind nearly knocked Jackson back into the sea, but he caught himself. They threw ropes, secured life vests, and pulled the terrified men onto the rescue boat one at a time. Another flash of lightning, another giant wave. The rescue boat tilted sharply. One fisherman slipped, falling toward the edge. Jackson dove without thinking. His fingers closed around the man's wrist just before a wave could yank him into the depths. The force nearly tore Jackson's shoulder apart, but he held on. "Pull!" he shouted. Matthew grabbed Jackson's arm, and together they hauled the fisherman to safety. In that moment, in the middle of a violent sea fighting nature itself, Jackson realized something. This, right here, was what NAVSOG had trained him for. Not medals, not pride, not proving he was stronger, but saving lives, serving with humility, fighting alongside brothers. When they finally returned to Sangley Point, drenched and battered, the rescued fishermen bowed deeply, thanking them over and over. Jackson shook his head. "Walang anuman," he said, his Tagalog slightly accented but heartfelt. Matthew smiled approvingly. "You learned well." Word spread quickly throughout the base. The American SEAL and the Filipino operator who led a storm rescue together, side by side, equal in grit and heart. That night around the training grounds, recruits and operators approached Jackson with questions, admiration, and gratitude. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He had become part of the story of the unit, part of its legacy. On the last day of the joint exercise, the NAVSOG commander gathered everyone for a closing briefing. Jackson expected a handshake, maybe a few photos, maybe a quiet goodbye like last time. But instead, something unexpected happened. The commander called him to the front. The operators stood tall, their formation perfect, their expressions solemn. Matthew stepped forward and held something small in his hand, a new NAVSOG patch, freshly stitched, more detailed than the training patch Jackson had earned years ago. "This," Matthew began, "is not given for completing tests. It is not given for surviving training. It is given for brotherhood and for proving you carry our values, even when no one is watching." Jackson's heart pounded. Matthew pinned the new patch onto his uniform under the SEAL emblem, right beside the first one. "This is for courage," Matthew said. "This is for humility, and this is for heart." For the first time, Jackson didn't fight the emotion rising in his chest. He let it pass through him like a wave, heavy, warm, unforgettable. The commander raised his voice. "Jackson Hayes, you are not just a guest of NAVSOG. You are our brother. Wherever you go, you carry our name." The operators saluted him, and Jackson, overwhelmed, saluted back. When the time came for Jackson to leave again, he stood at the loading ramp of the aircraft and turned one last time. Matthew stood with his arms crossed, the wind blowing gently through his hair. The jungle behind him swayed as if acknowledging the moment. "You know," Jackson said, "I used to think being strong meant being better than everyone. But here, I learned strength is about who you stand with." Matthew nodded. Brotherhood makes warriors. They shook hands. A long, firm handshake filled with memories, gratitude, and an unbreakable bond. "I'll return," Jackson said. "We'll be here," Matthew replied. And as Jackson boarded the aircraft, he looked at the 2 patches on his uniform. Navy SEAL NAVSOG. 2 worlds, 2 families. One warrior molded by both. Time passed, missions came and went. Recruits became soldiers. Rangers became leaders. And Jackson Hayes became known across bases not just for his skill, but for something far rarer in elite units: humility. Recruits idolized him, commanders trusted him, soldiers respected him, but Jackson never claimed credit. Instead, during every briefing, every training session, every moment of hardship, he reminded them, there's always someone stronger out there. So stay humble, stay sharp, keep learning. One evening, after a long day of training recruits, Jackson opened his locker again. Both NAVSOG patches were there, pinned neatly side by side. He touched them lightly. They were reminders of a younger version of himself, a man who thought strength was loud and visible, and a man who discovered that real strength was quiet, disciplined, and built from heart. A knock sounded on the door. "Sir," a new recruit said, "is it true you trained with Filipino commandos?" Jackson smiled. "Not just trained," he said softly. "I grew there." One morning, years after the storm rescue, Jackson received a message. A familiar voice filled the room. "Brother, this is Matthew. We're initiating a new joint exercise next month. We want you here to lead with us." Jackson didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he replied. "Always." He looked once more at the patches on his locker, grabbed his gear, and prepared for the journey. Not a journey back, but a journey home. Jackson Hayes arrived in the Philippines, confident and proud. He left humbled, transformed, and honored. NAVSOG didn't just test his body. It reshaped his mind. It strengthened his spirit. It gave him a brotherhood that crossed oceans. And for the rest of his life, wherever he served, in deserts, jungles, mountains, or oceans, he carried the lessons of the Filipino warriors who taught him something priceless. True strength is not loud, not arrogant, not selfish. True strength is humble, disciplined, courageous, and full of heart.